So I will talk about how we created a translation pipeline at Spotify. If you don't know, Spotify is one of the world's largest music streaming services when it comes to on-demand streaming. We have development offices in Stockholm, Gothenburg in Sweden, and in the US. We're available in an ever-increasing number of markets, and we require 19 languages today. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that we are hiring. Android developers are in high demand. So I've been part of Spotify since 2012, working in the core Android team. I was also here last year, where I talked about how to improve your applications by applying static analysis. Who went here? Nice to see so many coming back here. So there will be time for questions after the end of the presentation. And if there is something immediate you want to know, just ask. Why should you be here? So you'll get an insight in what kind of problems that we're facing when handling large amounts of translations, and how we fixed all these problems. So they should serve as an inspiration to you. Who watched Danny Poislow's presentation earlier today? Quite a few. So he addressed a lot of the issues that you're facing when it comes to quality of your translations, but not so much on handling the translations in a pipeline. So if you're creating an application that is supposed to be launched in other than your home market, you might want to look into translating your applications. How many are here developers? How many are available in only one language? All right, quite a lot. So I would assume English and Croatian. Today, Spotify is installed on 92 million Android devices. As you can see in the statistics, we have almost 50% of our users are using it in English, but 1/5 is using it in Spanish. And then German and Portuguese comes in on a shared third spot. Interestingly enough, we have 2,000 Croatian users as well, which is amazing because we are not even launched in Croatia. So if you're using an application in Spanish, or if you're using your phone in Spanish, any English-only application will really stick out. And sometimes you're not even able to use it properly because of the language barriers. So if you're convinced that translations is a good idea, I'm going to show you a typical setup of a translations pipeline. So we have a number of developers, at least one, I hope, that is putting in new strings, changing strings, and removing strings in a repository. And this repository is managed by some integration process, could be a team or the same developer, but at least it's being integrated by someone. Then you would use a translations vendor, which is, for example, a third party that receives these strings, and then you can they will send out these strings to translators that will work their magic on them, and then they will send back these translations to the vendor. And at some point we will bring in the translations into the integration team, and then we'll build a release build and finally and hopefully launch it to end users. So the vendors and the translations can also be part of a larger corporation. We're still too small to have in-house translators. Excuse me a second. So when I joined Spotify in 2012, we had a number of languages, And we had a vendor-based translation organization, but we didn't have a good process for managing them. So I'll show you a couple of issues that we were facing. So to begin with, if we have multiple developers adding strings into a repository, you will invariably face some merge conflicts. Let's have a look at an example. We have a master branch, and it already has some strings. And then you have the cool feature that's being developed by the cool developer. And you have the awesome feature that is being developed by the awesome developer. And so the cool feature gets a string added, and the awesome feature gets another string added. At some point, the cool developer merges his changes back into master. And when the awesome developer wants to merge into master, there will be a merge conflict. There will have to be some conflict resolution. You will have to rebuild the whole project again because files changed. So this created a lot of back and forth and frustration for developers. What worked rather well was that we had tooling for uploading the strings to the vendor. So every time we merged in something into the repository, we would automatically push the strings to the vendor through their web API. And we use a Python tool to do that. If we didn't have a continuous integration server doing this, someone would have to remember to push manually. So as an example, configuration file, we can specify that for a given branch, say master, on the vendor side, we will download into app source main res values, etc., etc. And so when we're, as you can see here, if we're uploading files, then we will upload the English files, and we have configuration sections where we say that, okay, the locale is called en, my locale on the Android side is nothing in particular, so it will map to values /strings.xml. But when we're downloading files, we have a long list of languages that's the current list of languages that we're using. And we'll put the files in the res folder appropriately. If you're worrying, no, the API key is a fake one. The configuration file also makes it very easy to add a new language. Say if we're introducing Croatian, we would just add it to the list. We would add a section for it in the config, and we would just pull the translation, see if they're available at the vendor. So once the strings have actually reached the vendor, they will be sent out to the translators, and the translators would invariably have questions. What do you mean by save? Do you mean saving something in memory, or do you mean to save to block a ball from scoring in a sport, or rescuing someone? And these questions would come back through the vendor to the integration team, and the integration team would either scratch their heads and try to figure out who added the string, defer the question to that person, or try to figure it out from the source code themselves. So that created a lot of back and forth. The translator couldn't work on the translation while waiting for our reply. And then once the translations have been done, someone will have to remember to download these strings as well. That was quite often overlooked. We had built the release build, we were almost ready to ship, and we realized, oh, we've got to pull the latest translations. and obviously that caused a lot of panic and a bit of overwork. Developers would also ask the integration team, when will you pull the strings next time? I want to test my feature manually, and we would pull when people asked. So the vendor has support for published and so-called pre-published strings. Pre-published means that the translator has made the work, but it has not been approved by the translations manager, meaning that that there might be corrections needed to it. But a published string means that everything seems to be okay on our side. Let's use this translation, and you can go on to another ticket. So we only download the published strings. So if we actually had any issues that showed up, then we'd also have to ask translators to go back to the things that they thought they were already done with. So as you understand, the process, or lack of it, it costs us a lot of time and effort. So while we were improving the situation, we were thinking of two aspects. It should be as automated as possible, and the feedback loops should be as tight as possible. So automation is useful because if you're following a manual process, you all know that you're missing out on some steps every now and then. And feedback loops, if the developer is adding a string and there is something wrong with it, then the developer should know about it as soon as possible, not when the translators are puzzled about the string. And the same thing if the translator has introduced an error, then obviously we should want to know about it as soon as possible and not when it goes live. So right now, the process has become so smooth that people don't even think about the translation process. They just add their strings and magically they will appear a few days later. So how did we get there? A couple of improvements have been done. So when a developer is adding adding a string, it's also mandatory to add translator instructions to it. It might seem obvious to do this, but well, there is nothing in the Android tools that hint about this, and so we came up with this in cooperation with the vendor. It's also mandatory to add contacts for when you add a string. You just say, "Okay, I'm adding this string. Reach me if you have any issues with it." So those are both checked by using static analysis. Surprise, surprise. Is it for me? Secondly, the strings must be ordered by their identifier. So apart from that, everyone likes order and neatness, obviously. There is a very good purpose to it, because if you're adding a string, it's likely that it will be kind of randomly put into the strings XML file. And so you will actually avoid a lot of merge issues. So if my identifier starts with B, I would put it near the top of the string file, and there won't be any conflicts with someone adding a string with the identifier starting with Z. So and that's obviously also checked with static analysis, custom Android lint. So it's impossible to forget what's expected of you. There is no developer comes into the company and asks, "Hey, what am I supposed to do here?" They will get slapped on the fingers. They learn after one mistake, and then they can be as productive as anyone else. So as an example, we have a master string. The name, suggested tweet, cat feedback texts suggest that it's fairly low in the strings XML file. It was added by Jonas Bengtsson, and the comment says that it's a pre-filled tweet text. The hashtag fresh Spotify hashtag should not be translated, and maximum 135 characters. That should answer all the questions that a translator can come up with. When it comes to downloading the strings, this is done automatically once every hour by our CI servers. And when we're downloading the strings, no surprise there, we also run a lot of static analysis on them. We run all the automated UI tests on them, and if the checks pass, we will create a commit and merge it into the repository. That will also create a release build, and so you have actually a release candidate with the latest translations available all the time. As an example for verifying the translations, we have, for example, new %s, which became atarashi %d. These things actually went into live production at some point, and this caused number format exceptions in very specific locales. And it takes you a while to figure out why your application is crashing for people only in Germany. We're also checking for this little error. Best regards, Spotify, herzliche Grüße, and new line Spotify. I don't know why translators might add new lines. They do at some point. That's a question on its own. But at least we can detect that if there is no new line in the original string, there shouldn't be one in the translation either. And the converse, if there is a new line in the master string, we also expect there to be one in the translation. And with the correct distribution, two succeeding new lines should be two new lines in the translation as well. Translating something that looks like a hashtag, it's not okay with us. Fresh Spotify became Swedish Nytt Spotify, and that messes up the global campaigns. Spot the issue. This is not a font issue. Yes, exactly. So typographically, the left side here is the ellipsis character, which is 3 dots that belong together. If there is line break, if there is lack of space to lay out this text, the 3 dots will actually belong together and not be broken up as in dot dot new line dot. This is a check that is built into Android Lint, so I assume that most of us have already seen this. But the first one is also built in Android Lint check, but the two other ones are our custom ones. As I mentioned, we only used to fetch the strings that were considered published. That is, the translator is considered done with it and could move on. What we did instead was to also fetch the ones that have been pre-published, the ones that the translator has been done, but it hasn't been approved yet. And that means that we can shorten the feedback cycle so that the translator hasn't swapped that out of his memory. He will actually be able to get feedback on it and fix it within a reasonable time. So that's being done once every hour as well. And we run all the customary tests on them. So we send back the information straight to the translation vendor, where they take appropriate actions. So this is pretty much where we are at this point. There is always room for improvement. So some companies use generated screenshots. We have an extensive not unit tests. Well, we have that as well. The UI automation tests. And in theory, we can walk through the application. We can mark each string when we find them, take a screenshot, and attach that information to the string to be translated. But considering that we already send in translation comments, that covers most of the questions that a translator might have. We could also figure out how much space is allowed for this translation. That means obviously that if we can submit this information to the vendor, they will be able to figure out immediately, will this translation fit or not? I mean, as much as I like Finnish and Japanese, I mean, they are really painful languages to deal with. And in the spirit of automated testing, we can also figure out if a translation is out of bounds. Essentially running all our automated tests on the on every locale that we're supporting. So these tests, for example, for translated hashtags or misplaced new lines, those could also be, in theory, run on the vendor side, if we have some possibility to script our script their environment, say with a Python script. That would also mean that our custom requirements, say that we're disallowing translated hashtags, that could be verified on their side. So at the same time they're typing, they will get a red mark. All in the spirit of closing in on the feedback loop. We don't have a dashboard for the translation status. That is how many strings have been translated, 99% or 100%. This could be useful for gauging the releasable status for the application, but considering that normally the translators are done well before we have stabilized the release branch, it's not really much of an issue. One other kind of novel thing, I haven't seen it anywhere, is using differential linting. That is, you're looking at the diff between two commits to do static analysis instead of looking at the end result of the change. And that could, for example, see that, okay, so you removed this master string, but there is still, you changed the master string, but you didn't do anything about the translations. As you might be well aware of, lint will actually tell you if you have a translation for a master string that doesn't exist, but it can't figure out if a string has changed and if the translations are invalid. So that's something that would require a completely different tool. On a side note, differential linting can also be used, say, if you have an API call that you've been deprecating, then you will see that, hey, someone added a call to this API instead of removing. So you could fail a build because of that. And lastly, since we're polling, we're checking every hour. We're wasting a lot of CPU cycles if nothing has changed, especially during the night. But you never know. There could have been a new string. But the vendor has support for notifications through a webhook, so we should be able to poll when required. So, looking back at where we come from and where we are right now, if you ask the developers, they know exactly what's expected of them, and they don't even think about how if they have to do anything about the translations. It just happens automatically. The translations that we have now, they are high quality because of the translators have the information they need. If they make any mistakes, we catch them early. So the only translation issues we have are mostly whether a translation is appropriate or not. And that's something that a human would have to look at. And obviously, we feel much more at ease because we don't. Well, there is no one that has to remember to do any particular steps in this. It just simply works. So, in closing, what I want to bring out of this lecture is that if you have a translation pipeline, or for that matter, any pipeline, you would have to consider automation, adding scripts, tooling, removing yourself out of the equation. And once you have these scripts, you can run them on a CI server and go on with your lives. And make errors visible as fast as possible. At every step in the pipeline, there is plenty of opportunity to ensure that this issue that could have been caught in the first step doesn't make it to the third and fourth and fifth step. Just detect it as soon as possible. And I mean, in the end, translations should be something that just works. So that's my presentation so far. Thank you for coming. I'm available up here. You can ask any questions about this translation pipeline or about Spotify in general. The standard question is, when are you coming to Croatia? We want to come to Croatia, obviously. There is a bit of licensing issues in former Yugoslavia. Yes?
I have a question regarding the sample of the XML that you showed us with the string with these additional attributes.
Yes.
Custom ones. So what I'm curious about is...
That would be this one?
Yep, that's the one.
Yes.
So we have all these attributes. I suspect that the comment is mostly interesting to the actual vendors that do the translation.
Yes.
So when you get the translated strings back, and they get back into your code base, do all these strings have all these comments in? I mean, the translated ones.
Right.
Or do you clean them up?
We clean them up.
It looks like a very big boilerplate.
Yes. No, we clean them up. We only keep the identifier and the actual string value in it.
So also in the English strings? Right?
No, they are kept in the English strings.
Oh, so default strings have
yes.
these, and the translated ones are just
yes,
ID
exactly.
and value.
Yes, but the build environment strips out the custom tags or attributes.
One more question.
Sure.
So I'm curious. This is probably something that's more related to the other part of your process, the UI definition and specification of user stories, stuff like that. But in practice, from my experience, there are a lot of times when either user testing or reviewing the spec of a story changes the actual UX, which changes the strings. So do you have some kind of process that works around the issues when you send out something for translation and the strings change, or do you just handle it manually?
So the thing is that the vendor knows what is the latest string and whether there is a translation for it in their translation memory. So what would be important? Actually, no, it's solved automatically right now, but more or less. When we're uploading the strings with a changed copy, the old translations will be still left in the repository, and that I consider that an error by itself, because you would essentially have a mismatch in your current build. So I would like the developers to remove the translations there. But when we're polling the next time from the vendor sees that, okay, this string has a new value. We don't have any translations for that one yet, and we would just populate it. Well, just remove them from the translations file. So there would be an automatic fallback to the English string.
Any more questions?
There is one to your right as well.
Okay, I'll run there.
Yeah, hi. So I was wondering, what's your experience with translation vendors? How tightly you work with them? And basically, do you completely trust their translations, or do you perform some kind of verification?
We do. Obviously, you have to have a lot of trust in the vendors, because you rarely speak, say, Japanese. Some do, but we also do like a third-party verification of the application. Essentially, there are companies that are specializing in localization testing. They would go through the whole application and not only look for translation issues, but also other like number formatting issues, icons that are translated. Icons with texts in them, etc. So once every while we will send them out for a peer review, so to speak.
Thanks.
Hi, over here.
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is when the developer adds a new string,
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned if the ID starts with B, does he go in order to exact point where it should be, or
Yeah.
just somewhere around?
No,
A or
sorted
B?
alphabetically.
Sorted. Okay, so there's no automation that would, once you have XML with strings of, I don't know, several hundreds IDs.
Right.
Is it possible to somehow automatically order it alphabetically? Or?
The short answer is yes.
Yes.
But we don't have that kind of tooling, because you normally don't add more than a few strings at the same time, and often they are grouped in some kind of feature, as we have in this example, suggested tweet, cat feedback tweet. Typically, if you're adding something, a couple of features, a couple of tweets, you would group them under suggested underscore tweets underscore whatever. So the amount of strings that you put in is not really a big issue. If people actually put in 20 plus strings with very different identifiers, it's easily done with a Python script or whatever to automate this.
So not with stock Android Studio feature?
No.
Okay. The second one, do you use any unwritten rule, like how to name the ID of the string? Let's say if one string is used in one activity and the second one is the other, is there main difference?
Well, you can wing it, but normally the people will add them some kind of namespacing, like in this case with suggested tweet, and since they're namespaced, it also deters people from reusing the string in a completely different context. Poisler earlier today also talked about the risk of reusing a string that has been used for something else. You might have the word save, and in some context in the application it means actually rescuing someone. In another it means saving the application state. But if you have namespace, then it deters people from reusing it, because it feels wrong to reuse it simply.
No more questions?
I also answer questions regarding Tango, but
Any questions on Tango? Afterwards, maybe during the party. Thank you so much, David. Thank you very much.